A simple philosophy that I always like to follow. Always appreciate what is beautiful, even if it's a mask that's worn by a malicious evil. That's the horrible truth behind beauty, how it can easily succeed its goals of not showing us who the real monsters are, when we gaze upon something that can only be described as mesmerizing. And sometimes, well, most times, we would fail to see how we find ourselves becoming the helpless moth that's being lured into the irresistible flame. Today's story is about a girl that is the very definition of beauty and physical perfection, an evil that cannot be simply explained by mere words, but rather experienced by our inner desires, whereas the feelings of love is muddled with lust and mindless worship, and what we can describe as our human ways of expressing such feelings is soured by the intense need to achieve our inner desires, the very element that can bring any man to his knees. But what if this curse was tainted by man's inner need for violence? Just imagine what kind of twisted story you would achieve when we see a monster driving man into his most primal and sadistic stage, and knowing how far man would be willing to go to achieve his obsessive desires and fulfill his sadistic urges. Let's just say that this may not be a story for the faint of heart. Story begins with a death. A victim whose name will forever be remembered as Tomi Kawakami, and who was once an irresistible evil, before she had become a victim to a violent murder. It was a horrendous crime that had sent everybody into a state of shock and fear. Rather than finding Tomi's deceased body, there was nothing left but a handful of pieces and small body parts that were recently found throughout the unnamed town. And nobody would have known that the victim of this brutal crime was Tomi if it wasn't for her head being discovered, which had investigators believe that the killer had wanted Tomi's death to be uncovered, especially the fact of how Tomi's head was poorly hidden in comparison to the other body parts. But that's all they had really, a hunch, a victim, well, just a few pieces of her, no motive, and no suspect. According to the last people who had seen her alive, which was Tomi's teacher, Mr. Tagagi, her boyfriend, Yamamoto, and her close friend, Riko, and all the other classmates she was with, nobody had seen anything suspicious after their school trip to see the plants of Yukigahara, leaving authorities with the assumption that it was sometime after nature class. That's when it happened, when Tomi was murdered by a violent psychopath. And it wasn't an easy day for Mr. Tagagi and his class when the world had learned of Tomi's demise, spending all day being questioned and trying to recollect their memories. Tomi's murder had shocked everybody. It had made some people saddened, angered, and fearful, and it had even made Mr. Tagagi ashamed for what had happened. And as of now, there are still no clues, no leads, absolutely nothing that can help authorities on coming any closer on knowing the identity of this killer. In a way, everybody who had known Tomi had suffered in a variety of ways, especially Yamamoto and Riko. And as word spreaded throughout school that there's still a killer who's roaming free, which is why the girls should remain cautious when walking alone. As of right now, Tomi's death is nothing more but a lesson to be taught within Mr. Tagagi's class, a fact of life that must be accepted. Even though it hurts, that there's a painful burden. What happened was dreadful, but Tomi is dead, and she won't be coming back. Stern words from Mr. Tagagi, a vow that would help his students move on from their painful memories of Tomi. Unfortunately, Mr. Tagagi is about to discover the horrible reality behind his enthusiastic promise, because sometimes no matter how hard you try, sometimes it's kind of hard to move on from the horrible past when you're trying to outrun your demons, especially when the demons are standing at the door of Mr. Takagi's classroom. It was like reality had suddenly taken a step into a nightmare. There she was, Tomi Kawakami, in the flesh and blood. A mystery that had confused an entire town, a supernatural story that would be shared amongst students. Ghost Girl or Sexy Zombie Girl. But according to a small percentage of the school, this was not supposed to happen. Many people had instantly assumed that the girl was Tomi's twin or a lookalike who was playing a sick joke by posing as a dead girl. Some were convinced that this was actually Tomi's ghost coming back from the grave to either reveal the killer's identity or for revenge. According to the dental records, the girl was in fact Tomi Kawakami. However, because of how the remains of what was supposed to be Tomi's deceased body were cremated after the funeral, there was no way to prove that it was Tomi Kawakami who'd been murdered. Regardless of how strange and how many people were convinced that Tomi had been slain, evidence shows that Tomi had never died. Or, in better wording, the lack of evidence that she died. But for Mr. Takagi, it was strange as to how he was shaken by this miraculous resurrection. Whereas everybody began to doubt the idea that Tomi had actually came back from the grave, where the line between fact and superstition was starting to make itself very clear for most people. Mr. Takagi, however, refused to believe the idea that this girl was Tomi. In a private conversation with this girl in the night study room, Mr. Takagi refused the idea that he was talking to a ghost. I mean, she had Tomi's irresistible likeness, her seductive charm, even that sinister personality that's poorly kept hidden behind that innocent smile. Mr. Takagi just could not deny the belief that this had to be a twin or somebody's idea of a sick joke. That the school, the town, they were wrong. This was not Tomi Kawakami. It just couldn't be. It was a charade that had already went beyond its devious goals, and it needed to be stopped. And Mr. Takagi had tried convincing this girl to put an end to this twisted scheme, which not only ended with no success, but with secrets being shared. The kind of forbidden and intimate secrets that only Tomi would be able to share. Nobody knew what had happened or how it happened. But Mr. Takagi's private meeting with Tomi's ghost was the last time anybody had seen Mr. Takagi as a functional human being who was sane and rational. But it wasn't Mr. Takagi who was the only one that was shaken by this resurrection. Tomi's boyfriend, Yamamoto, who was constantly hounded and smothered by someone who was supposed to be dead. A curious way to describe Yamamoto's feelings for Tomi. Supposed to be dead. Even after the authorities had declared Tomi's death as a mistake. Would have you assume that Yamamoto would embrace Tomi's resurrection? Two lovers who would once again embrace each other's love. Except, it wasn't like that. An obvious sign that there was definitely something wrong. You see, aside from those who found Tomi's mistaken death as the center topic throughout school, it was Tomi's classmates who were sharing the wonderful experience of being overwhelmed with the sensation of fear and tormenting anxiety. Because only 43 people strongly believed that this was not a mistake with forensics. Because they knew Tomi wasn't supposed to be alive. According to everybody who had known Tomi, It wasn't like she was the most popular girl in school in a positive way. In fact, she was more like the opposite. More like someone who was hated because of her manipulative personality and deceptive ways. I mean, sure, Tomi would have all the boys turn their heads and all the girls wishing they had her looks, but overall, nobody really liked the girl. Nobody except her closest friend, Riko. And even though Tomi was still alive, not even Riko could find the courage to face her. And believe me, it wasn't easy for Riko, trying to convince herself that it was all a mistake, that Tomi was not killed. And I think that Riko was the only one who tried convincing herself that Tomi was truly alive. Then, one day, when Riko was walking with Tomi, who was demanding why everybody was acting so weird towards her, even sharing her frustration over Riko's lack of words and distant behavior, it was when both girls were crossing a bridge, and Tomi's ramblings had suddenly went silent. It was the kind of silence that had struck Riko with an intense fear when she remembered the bridge. And there she was, looking over the bridge, fixated with the water below, oblivious to Riko and all of her surroundings, standing within a specific spot that should be very familiar to Riko. That, my friends, was when Riko knew that there was no doubt that this was Tomi Kawakami, and that Tomi was killed. Rather, this was some kind of ghost seeking vengeance for what was done to her, or whatever supernatural reasons behind this resurrection. It was an unbearable nightmare that was becoming too much for Riko's conscience. The haunting and hounding reminder of that ungodly day in the mountains. There was just no way that Riko could carry the burden any longer, that every time she would see Tomi, the memories of that day just keeps getting heavier and heavier to carry. She had to bring this badness to an end. And when Riko ran into Yamamoto, confessing her intent of violating a sworn truce, thankfully both Riko and Yamamoto had shared a common goal, that the only way they can be free from this madness was that they had to turn themselves in to the authorities and tell them everything. It was like any other school day. A beautiful day. Nothing special. Nothing that could prepare someone for what was about to happen. It was after fifth period where Mr. Tagagi's class had decided to take a trip to the small mountains of Inariyama, near a specific cliff that overlooks a great deal of scenic nature, a great place where students would go for geography studies. But obviously, we're here to talk about Tomi. As you already know, Tomi Kawakami was definitely a girl who knew how to stand out amongst the crowd, hated by envious girls and obsessed by boys and men all alike. Lord, how she would revel it all in. And even though Riko was good friends with Tomi, well, Tomi wasn't the kind of girl whose popularity had made her very good at socializing with the other students. Because of her reckless behavior, her over-the-top vanity, and long history of manipulating boys, destroying relationships, pretty much there was never a day in school where Tomi wouldn't be teased and hated for her dreadful personality and shameful character. And Tomi didn't really care for any of the vile rumors and remarks that would shadow her on a daily basis. According to Tomi, they were nothing but petty words being uttered by little squabbling children who could never be as beautifully irresistible as herself. Tomi being treated like she was a cancerous disease throughout school was sadly a common thing. Even Riko, her only friend, would also admit that Tomi had taken pride with her dreadful reputation, especially in regards to her most recent act, a secret love affair she had between herself and Mr. Tagagi. And that was the thing about Tomi. She was the kind of girl who wasn't really good at keeping things discreet around school. It was like she had this twisted sense of pride with her nefarious actions. Like it was a power she enjoyed using every chance she got, displaying someone's misery and suffering as a personal achievement, And it wasn't just Mr. Takagi who had found himself being manipulated into one of Tomi's twisted games, but it was also her boyfriend Yamamoto, who was also being sucked into this emotional and tormenting relationship, forced into watching his devoted love for Tomi being soured by this horrendous act, not having the courage to stand up against Tomi, constantly fearing of losing something so precious and beautiful. Let's just say that it was on that day, in the Inariyama Mountains, that was when everybody had finally reached their breaking point with Tomi. You see, in the past month, Tomi had been pursuing this campaign of pressuring and even blackmailing Mr. Takagi into divorcing his wife, with the hollow promises of being happily married after graduation. Of course, everybody knew that Tomi wouldn't do no such thing, seeing how she's done this before. And much like the other classmates, Yamamoto has spent every day watching Tomi cling onto Mr. Takagi like he was her personal plaything, constantly with their venomous tactics that was forcing the teacher to his knees, with the promises of exposing their secret love affair to the other school officials, or how about spreading a rumor of how a well-respected teacher had went so far that he ended up getting one of his students pregnant. And not knowing that Yamamoto was eavesdropping during one of these private conversations when finding Tomi and Mr. Takagi sitting together on the cliff, let's just say that whatever Yamamoto had heard was enough for him to snap and take a stand against Tomi and her devious actions. And as the other classmates would witness the intense commotion between Tomi and Yamamoto, a violent argument that would have the shy Yamamoto striking Tomi across the face with a hard slap in a fit of rage, it was an anticipating scene that would come with unexpected results when Tomi had lost her balance and plummeted from the cliff. Till this day, Riko would never forget the sound of muffled bones being broken when Tomi's body had landed. Normally, in a situation like this, where a violent accident would have the involuntary reaction of somebody seeking help, except this time, nobody had bothered on trying to reach any medical assistance. Instead, Mr. Takagi and the entire class had decided to protect Yamamoto by disposing Tomi's body, more like rid themselves of an unbearable cancer. Hiding Tomi's broken body was an unthinkable act, but after the grief and torment that this girl had put everybody through, enduring her dreadful personality, Mr. Takagi and most of the other classmates strongly felt that nobody was worth having their lives being ruined because of Tomi's death. For all they cared, Tomi had finally gotten what she deserved. In joining the other girls on the other side of the mountain while Mr. Takagi and the other boys did the bloody deed of disposing Tomi's body, Riko had never known what had happened when Tomi's body was cut into pieces, just vague and gruesome details that she would hear later. Stripping themselves down to their undergarments while using cutting tools from woodshop class to perform the dismemberment. Riko remembered when one of the boys mentioned how Tomi was still alive when they began cutting into her. It was Mr. Takagi who was the one that took the pleasure of finishing her off before they began disemboweling her. They were even sadistically playing with Tomi's entrails and body parts, while Yamamoto was off to the side, overwhelmed with shock and emotional grief while comforting Tomi's decapitated head. And this may sound unbelievable, but this was unlike Mr. Takagi and Riko's classmates. And I know it's hard to believe, but these people are not monsters, nor the kind of people who would do something like this. Which is why nobody had suspected Mr. Takagi or any of his classmates when the world had learned about Tomi's death. When they were finally done with the body, all that was left was a fleshy mound of organs, bone, and blood. Lots of blood. Somewhere along the way, disposing Tomi's body had become a vengeful and sadistic ritual when Mr. Takagi had decided to have Tomi cut into 42 pieces. A single piece that would be packaged and given to every student who had endured the vileness and manipulation of this dreadful girl. 42 pieces of Tomi for 42 students who were individually responsible for disposing these packages, where they will never be found. Obviously, it seemed like some of the students had failed when Tomi's head and a handful of other packages were found a couple days later. As for Riko, who happens to be Tomi's only friend, she was given Tomi's heart, and not knowing where to hide it, Riko's desperate attempt to rid herself and her memories of that horrible incident had given Riko no other option but to toss it over a bridge that was nearby and washed away down the river, as she tried to move on with her life, forgetting about her friend and what had happened in the mountains. You see, my friends, the point of this twisted story is that there is no mistake, no confusion, and absolutely no doubt. Tomi is dead. What had happened on that day in the mountains was beyond shameful and unthinkable. An unbearable weight that was pushing Riko and Yamamoto to the very edge of sanity. And to see Tomi Kawakami walking through the halls of school a week later, the day after her funeral ceremony, and going through an entire school day as if nothing had happened, toying with everybody's emotions and sanity when students begin doubting their grasp on reality, even driving Mr. Takagi into a mental breakdown that had crippled his way of normality. Regardless of how vile and dreadful Tomi was, or the fact that she had somehow came back from the grave, what had happened was inhumane and wrong, which is why the story of Tomi's death had to be known. But the idea of letting the world know about the horrible incident within the mountains had unfortunately placed both Riko and Yamamoto in a dangerous situation. Because when the other students had learned about this act of betrayal, there was no way the other classmates were going to let both Riko and Yamamoto live long enough to share this story to the authorities. And like prey being hunted by a pack of wolves, eventually the troubled pair had found themselves being chased down and cornered, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. And as Riko and Yamamoto were only seconds away from becoming victims to another horror story, it was the unexpected appearance of a haunting ghost that had stopped the other classmates from performing another ritualistic bloodbath. Because of how this exclusive party were the only ones who knew that Tomi had somehow defied the laws of death, with no easy way to explain it. Maybe it was because of our internal fear of the unknown, that the spiteful hatred that the other students had once held for Tomi had now turned itself into an intense fear that had resulted with our bloodthirsty murderous classmates running for their very lives. To this day, Riko will always see Tomi as someone who was once a good friend, regardless of what kind of person she was. What was done to her was wrong, which is why Riko had to seek forgiveness for not doing nor saying anything. But it seemed that Tomi had cared very little for Riko's pleading words, seeing how she had her sights set on a pathetic lover. Obviously, a cue for Riko to make her exit. That, my friends, was the last time Riko had saw both Yamamoto and Tomi. It's been 3 days since the incident. After confessing everything to her parents, Riko had found herself moving to another town, which wasn't all that bad seeing how it was near an ocean. A great place to help her overcome with what had happened. Since then, nearly most of the other classmates had left school. 2 of them had committed suicide. Mr. Takagi had found himself being sent to a mental hospital because of his delusional and violent behavior. Even though he confessed of being responsible for Tomi's murder and shared much more bizarre details about her, Unfortunately, his confession was seen as nothing more than delusional ramblings. An hour after Rico had left Yamamoto and Tomi, even Yamamoto had suffered the same fate when he was later found. Now just a shell of his former self who's forever crippled from a life of normality. As for Tomi, well, even till this day, the story of her death had still remained hidden. Even if Rico had went to the authorities, it was doubtful if anybody would believe her. But Rico didn't know what had become of her former friend. Last she heard, it seemed that Tomi had also disappeared as well. But deep down inside, there was that feeling, or maybe it was stumbling across a familiar scrap of paper and string. Somehow, Rico knew that someday, just around the corner, will be a new Tomi. My friends, I thank you so much for having one of my previous stories reach a personal milestone of mine and showing me that there is something special with my wonderful show. And I know that right now I'm spoiling a certain handful of my audience with this unique story, but I also just want to say that there is a variety of stories that I have lined up that I hope everybody around the world or who stumbles onto my show can experience and enjoy with a fair and open mind. You do know that there are more ways than one to enjoy the world of horror. Anyways, if you want to help and support my channel and help me iron out a few flaws and see it grow into something greater, then feel free to wander onto my Patreon with the link below. If you have questions, comments, or interesting curiosities, the best way to have your words reach my attention would be through my Twitter account with the link below as well. Until next time, my friends, thank you for watching the show.